Hello, my name is Jazlyn. Welcome. I am a co-author of the paper facilitating asynchronous participatory design of open source software, bringing end users into the loop. Our research question sought to answer the following question. How can we better facilitate design involving end users in asynchronous open source software to make the software more usable? Well, the motivation for this research came from the fact that as open source software has grown in popularity and teams have become more asynchronous and more remote, usability issues have also been pushed aside in favor of prioritizing code and functionality and efficiency. In a traditional company, a dedicated design team might meet in person in a boardroom to tackle issues related to usability through the route of participatory design. This is the specific design practice where all stakeholders, specifically the end users, join in the design process. However, in the asynchronous landscape, the question remains, how can we optimize these interactions? While end user input and collaborations, as well as dedicated design teams, are not a new concept to the open source community, there is no standardized process for conducting participatory design within an open source software. Prior work has focused a great deal on open source teams, particularly developers, and their attitudes towards usability issues. This paper is taking a step forward to understand the gap between open source developers, open source designers, and open source end users in order to better facilitate interactions between all three. Our methodology used an iterative process that began with defining the target user groups we focused on in this paper. Because open source developers had been a focus in prior efforts, we established our two target user groups should be designers and end users. And from here, we have our first contribution, the design guidelines. These guidelines can be seen in section C1 and include three key aspects: end user involvement, pipeline integration, and collaborative design artifact generation. These guidelines were then used to inspire and guide our ideation process, which was through rapid sketching. And some examples of these sketches can be seen here. We then used these sketches and conducted our open-ended user studies in the form of interviews with our target user groups. We conducted 2 studies for each user group, and we asked a series of unique questions designed to capture and understand the experiences and challenges of both user groups. Designers were asked questions related to collaborating with end users and communicating with the rest of their team. And end users were asked questions related to using the softwares and communicating with open source teams when there are usability issues. We used the results from these studies to create 2 personas, which are seen in section C2. Our first persona is Dakota. They are our OSS lead designer, and Dakota struggles to manage various platforms that their OSS uses to interact with the end user community, as well as communicating important design decisions to the rest of their team. Our second persona is Enrique. Enrique is our open source software end user. He's a community organizer, and he uses an OSS for organizing his volunteers. Some of his volunteers have unique struggles when using the app, but he can't fix them. And every time he tries to communicate with someone from the OS team, he has a bunch of barriers. We then used these personas to first further refine our design guidelines, and then through a human-centered approach, create our third and final contribution, our low-fidelity prototype. This prototype demonstrates a transparent participatory design through an updated repository page with features such as an end user portal and conversations held in a familiar manner. Next, we have the ability to create design artifacts. And lastly, from these design artifacts, designers can create associated issues that the rest of the developers on the open source team can then take a look at and tackle when they need to. That is the end of the presentation. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.